So, you're here because your teacher made you read The Golden Compass by Philip Pullman. That's alright. I'll help you out as much as I can here on this series we call Simply Lit. It means a lot to me if you can like this video and subscribe to my channel because it helps me to be able to continue to make these kinds of videos to support you all. Please like and subscribe now if you can. If you'd like to donate to my educational video career, please do so at the links in the video description. After the video, ask me any questions that you think will help you understand the story better and get that homework done. Also comment to make requests for videos on other literature. I'm Michael, and today I have my friend Zoe helping me discuss this book's summary and major themes.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Zoe. Enjoy this brief summary and analysis of Philip Pullman's The Golden Compass here on Simply Lit.
We'll start with the plot of the novel so we're all on the same page on what happens.
The novel opens with our protagonist, Lyra Balakwa, and she always runs wild around all of her home, Jordan College in Oxford, England, with her daemon, Pantaleon. And the daemons they're essentially people's souls that exist outside of their body in animal form, and the daemons do not have a fixed form when a person is younger, but as a person undergoes puberty, then their daemon takes on one particular animal form. So Lyra's daemon, Pantalaimon, can change into many different forms.
Yes, I always thought that was the coolest thing when I read this book as a kid. I always wanted a demon. I always thought it was like amazing to have a little animal friend.
Exactly. So you might see Lyra set in this point as a bird, or as a cat, or as a squirrel, any number of things, because he's always morphing into all these different shapes. That helps mirror Lyra's intentions, Lyra's moods, and Lyra's nervous system in a lot of ways too. Additionally, in her home of Jordan College, she's always running amok. For example, she steals coins out of a dead person's crypt in the college, an old scholar, because obviously she doesn't care much for this culture of old dried up scholarly people, and she likes to cause trouble and just have fun and live her life on her own terms. And who could blame her when she's just this ward of the college with no parents? So, for example, she steals coins out of a crypt, and she doesn't return them until she has a bad dream of the ghosts of the crypt telling her to bring it back, and her and Pantalaimon scare and guilt trip each other enough into doing so. The inciting incident of this novel comes when Lyra receives word that her uncle, Lord Asriel, will be visiting the college. When he arrives, Lyra is running around all these secret corridors of Jordan College, and she eventually comes into the same room that the master of Jordan College is talking with another professional at the college, and they are conspiring to poison Lord Asriel. Therefore, when Lord Asriel arrives, Lyra is able to warn him about not drinking the poisoned drink. And so Lord Asriel intentionally spills the drink, much to the dismay of the master of Jordan College. And little does Lyra know that this act she has taken will take her down this crazy path that we'll talk about more in a moment. And next, Lyra, after warning Lord Asriel, he tells her to stay put because they're in the same room in which he's going to give a presentation on this concept of this mysterious elementary particles, which we also come to find is dust. And it has a particular attraction to adults more than to children, but it, as we'll see, it kind of varies from state to state rather than quantity to quantity between adults and children. And so, in order to secure funding for this controversial research, and it's labeled as controversial in the book because it is in opposition to the values of the church in this world. And to make his point, Lord Asriel shows pictures of the Northern Lights amidst a concentration of dust, highlighting that through these images, one can see a parallel universe reflected in the dust. In order to prove his point, and that shows us a little bit more about how Lord Asriel is as a person, he shows the scholars the frozen head of the researcher who is in charge of this dust investigation, but it's found out to be later that this head is somebody else's head and not actually this scholar.
Yes, the scholar's name is Stanislaus Grumman, and he plays an important role actually in the second novel, The Subtle Knife. So after Lyra discovers this information about Lord Asriel's secret research, controversial research that he wants to pursue, she's very excited about the concept of the North and adventure. But she kind of goes back to her everyday life, and you start to learn as the novel progresses that there's quite a few children that go missing within Jordan College, Oxford, and the surrounding sort of towns. All of these children call the abductors gobblers. That's the name that they have. They even have games called where kids pretend to be gobblers and they chase each other. So it's almost sort of like a game, but you can kind of feel this impending doom sort of starting to happen. Then one of her friends, her best friend actually, Roger, goes missing. And that I think really unsettles Lyra because now it's quite personal. However, she doesn't have time for that to sort of sink in before Mrs. Coulter comes. And she knows who Mrs. Coulter is, and she's unlike any of the other people at Jordan College. A lot of the people at Jordan College are these sort of older men, presumably older white men, who are somewhat boring, who try to teach her, and it doesn't work. But Mrs. Coulter is exciting, and she's beautiful, and she has this amazing golden monkey demon that you can just is just like something you want to be around. She's somebody that you want to be around. So Lyra actually goes with Mrs. Coulter to London. But before she leaves Jordan College, she gets pulled by the master very early in the morning. She gets called by the master of Jordan College and is given a very important gift, which is called the alethiometer. It's a truth-telling device. It is also another name for it is the Golden Compass. That's the first title of the book. Each of the books are named after important instrument. And so it's a strange truth-telling device. And she figures out how to use it quite intuitively, actually. It's almost as if it comes naturally to her. And she goes with Mrs. Coulter to London. The master tells her that she must actually leave Jordan College because she is going to become a young woman, and a young woman cannot grow up being surrounded by old crusty men. So she must go. And so she goes to London. London is amazing to her. It's a big city and it's full of luxuries that she's never had, bubble baths and soft clothes. And she gets really sort of sucked in to this life in London, the luxury with Mrs. Coulter. And Pantalaimon is sort of nagging her, being like, Mrs. Coulter promised us that we were going to go to the north, and she's not fulfilling this promise at all. And so Lyra and Pantalaimon start sort of scheming like, okay, we're going to try to stay with her. Do we not? When are we going to go to the north? Except that there's a party that happens. And this party is very important because we learn who Mrs. Coulter really is at this party. She then learns that Mrs. Coulter is actually the head of the Gobblers, which is the General Oblation Board, which is a secret church-funded project. Now, the church's sort of overall political body is called the Magisterium, but this secret organization, the General Oblation Board, yes, Mrs. Coulter is in charge of it. It is a big reveal. It, I think, solidifies some of the feelings that Lyra is having about Mrs. Coulter, and she GTFOs, she gets out because no, you don't want to be with her. Also, the Golden Monkey, you kind of see how evil he is in this book as a kid reading it and watching the first movie. He really scared me. So Lyra flees, and she ends up fleeing to the Egyptians, which are a canal faring nomad people who many of their children have actually been abducted. She is on the boat with them. She is safe with Egyptians. They care for her, they love her. And while she is under their care and protection, it is revealed that Lyra is the daughter of Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter. So Lyra is now with Egyptians. She is feeling very safe, very comfortable, very fed. The Egyptians are incredibly kind, very strong people, lots of strong female characters. I loved reading that when I was younger. And they are set to do an expedition to the Arctic. They are going to get their kids back no matter what. And Lyra is going to help them, even if she's just a kid and even if she's not Egyptian. She's very strong-willed and she really wants to help, and she has to get her friend Roger back. So the Egyptians have been doing a lot of sort of reconnaissance sort of work and spying to try to figure out where their children are being held. And so they believe that they know now where the gobblers are holding their children, and it is very far up in the Arctic. The Egyptians and everyone, they stop in Charleston, and Lyra meets an armored bear named Yurik Björnson. The armored bears in this world are called the Pansabjörna. They are just, I suppose, like just a species of talking bears. Their armor is very strong, very important to them. It is basically equivalent to what humans have, like their demons. Like the bear's armor feels like that to them. So it's very important for them. They have their own culture and everything. So Lyra realizes that having an armored bear on their side would be incredibly helpful, and not only locating where the children are being held, but also pretty much getting anyone in their way, like just taking them out.
They do have to get Yorick Bernisson's armor back, because without it, he's a shell of his former self. He just drinks and eats all the time, and that's the only thing he wants to do.
So Lyra ends up using her alethiometer, which she had been practicing a lot on the boat, like with the Egyptians. She had a lot of time to sort of sit and think and get in a certain state of mind to understand what all of the symbols mean and all the levels of meaning that the symbols hold. And no one had taught her this. Again, it was just intuitively that she knew. So it usually actually takes years, decades of study to actually read the alethiometers. They're very rare instruments. I think in this world, there's maybe only like 3 or 4 that were ever created. And there's usually books that people actually have to use to know what all of the symbols' meanings are. But Lyra is able to just know how to read it and how to let her mind, as she says, climb down a ladder to find the meanings that she needs. So she's able to use the alethiometer to locate Yurik's missing armor. And in return, Yurik and his friend Lee Scoresby end up joining their group and their team. Lee Scoresby is an aeronaut. He's a Texas aeronaut, and he's quite a fun character. And he was an ally with Yurik Björnsson because they had fought in some wars beforehand, so they are close friends.
And an aeronaut in this world is sort of like a hot air balloon pilot.
Yes, hot air balloons, which again, I thought was super cool when I was a kid. And his demon is this like mangy kind of looking rabbit with beautiful eyes, and she always has something to say. And so now there's sort of a like team gathered together that's pretty strong, and they're getting ready to go more into the north to find the missing children. Also, while Lyra is in Charleston and in this town, she learns that Lord Asriel has actually been exiled to Svalbard, which is the main like citadel, I suppose, of the Pansabjörna. So she learns this, and so she also has yet another goal of potentially getting Lord Asriel out of the imprisonment of the armored bears. Another key sort of important piece of information that we learn in this section of the novel is while they're in Charleston, we get introduced to witches, which is another like group of people that are in this world. The witches live a very, very long time, and they have quite a lot of knowledge, natural knowledge of the world. And so while we're in Charleston and reading, we learn about a prophecy about Lyra. The Egyptians go to seek counsel from the witches, and they learn about this prophecy, which she must not know what the prophecy is. If she knows what the prophecy is, if Lyra knows what that is, it will be detrimental. And we also learn that there are many different types of witch clans and that they're choosing sides in an upcoming war. While we don't learn what the prophecy is in this moment, we do learn later what it is. And it's basically that Lyra is the second Eve. And her role essentially as Eve, which is, you know, like a huge symbol within the church, is that she's basically like taking down organized religion and basically destroying the religion of this world. And so she poses a huge threat. And a lot of people want to know what this prophecy is. And Mrs. Coulter will also stop at nothing to know what this prophecy is, including torturing witches to try and get it. So now that the group is come together, you have Egyptians, you've got Lyra, you've got a Pansabjörn, you got Liska, Scoresby, and Aeronaut. The team is together and they are continuing on to Bolvaner, which is the Gobbler's research station. They are guided by the alethiometer, which Lyra is reading and giving them directions. There is, however, an important detour that happens. There's some talk about what the Gobblers do. There's other terms that are used, such as the child cutters, but I don't think that up until this point it is for sure known what is happening to these kids. So Lyra is getting to know the alethiometer. It almost has like a consciousness, and she can sense that the alethiometer is actually trying to tell her something. So they do this very important detour to this village, and Lyra discovers an abandoned child. And this child has his demon, does not have his demon. There's no demon with this child, which is in this world utterly disgusting, and it causes one to be both almost have a sense of revulsion and deep sadness and pain and anguish. It's like not seeing someone's soul. So it's deeply horrendous to see this. And when Lyra finds this child, everyone is very scared of the kid, and he's just clinging on to this like dried piece of fish. It's like very, very sad. But Lyra in that moment chooses compassion and brings this child back to the Egyptians and everyone else on the team to sort of show actually what's been happening, which is that the work that the Gobblers are doing is cutting demons away from kids. So when I read this as a kid, I mean, I thought this was absolutely horrendous, but the process is called, intercision. It's this soul splitting process. And so as Lyra, finds this out, everyone finds this out, the child actually dies, very sad, and they're just having to continue on. However, at some point, there's a storm that comes in, and Lyra and everyone else is actually attacked by bounty hunters. And in the process, because there's so much storm, like a big storm, so much snow, everything, Lyra is captured and actually taken to Bolvaner. She is briefly reunited with Roger, who is also being held there. So she does achieve sort of one of her goals of finding out where Roger is and trying to get him. But now, how do they get out of this place, this horrible place? And she gets almost separated from pantomime, and she almost has the intercision process done to her, which again is like the height of tension, like a very climactic moment. But right before it happens, Mrs. Coulter actually arrives and halts this intercision process from occurring, which is interesting. We later on we're going to dig into the characters, but in this moment you can kind of see the confliction going on with Mrs. Coulter because this is her daughter. So while she thinks that this process of cutting the soul away from a child is good for them, she doesn't want it to happen to her own daughter because a lot of the kids end up dying. So she takes Lyra away, and there's a moment where they're sort of trying to, Lyra is trying to understand, like, why would adults even be doing this? It's so horrible. And that's sort of when there's more of a discussion about dust, and that dust and puberty bring on these troubling adult emotions. And if you can just do a little cut, as Mrs. Coulter says, and all of those things can just go away. And by that, you look like a shell of a person and just dead inside. And actually, some of the adults have this process done. And the way that they describe the demons is like having a pretty pet, which again is like just like this sort of like disgusting thing of like having one's soul just become like nothing. And so Lyra, of course, thinks that's horrible and knows that it is very wrong to be doing this, even with all of the lies that Mrs. Coulter is trying to get her to believe. So after Lyra learns this information about dust, about why the General Oblation Board and the church wants to do all this stuff to quote unquote help the kids. Again, it's like a GTFO moment. Lyra's like, we got to get out of here now. So she actually figures out how to activate Bolvaner's emergency alarm. And she does that through having this sort of ability to lie and also observe and also sort of trick adults into thinking that she's dull. And by doing that, she's able to really ascertain a lot of important information. So she sees, because of a practice alarm that happens a little bit earlier, that the adults are very ill equipped to handle any real situation, emergency situation. So Lyra figures out how to, again, activate the emergency alarm. She sets the station on fire, and all of the children evacuate. And in this moment of chaos, she is able to get the kids to go. Beforehand, she makes sure they have all of their winter gear because it is, again, like the north, so it's really cold. So they're walking, and she's trying to get them to make sure they walk, because if they don't walk, they'll freeze and die. So they're trying to walk and hoping that they're going to be able to find any of the other party group to help them. And eventually they are rescued by Lee Scoresby, Yurik, the Egyptians, and the Witch Clan, led by Serafina Pekkala. She is probably the main witch that gets talked about within the trilogy. She's also very cool. I liked her a lot. And the witches do play a very important role in the book. So there's a big battle that happens there's a big battle that ensues. Lots of bow and arrow fighting, lots of action, lots of tension. And Lyra, Roger, and Yurik are able to flee in Lee Scoresby's hot air balloon. Lyra directs the witches to sort of tow the balloon because there is a lot of wind and storm sort of action. It's hard for Lee Scoresby to just sort of fly the balloon on his own. But the next step in Lyra's plan is to save Lord Asriel, who is in Svalbard. She ends up falling out of the balloon. Lyra does. Again, there's a storm, so she falls out of the balloon, and she is taken by the Pansabrona to the castle of their usurping king, Yorfor Arachnisin. And we get to sort of see Yorfor Arachnisin and see that really he doesn't want to be a bear. He actually wants to be a human. And again, Lyra is able to use her ability to lie and sort of have this like meek expression to sort of gain information. So she sort of sees this about your Arachnus. He even has a stuffed creature that he wants that he treats as if it's his demon. She's able to trick Yorfer into fighting Yurik Bjornison, who arrives with Roger to rescue Lyra. And Yurik is able to defeat Yorfer and ends up killing him and regains his rightful place as king of the Pansabjorna. An important, not even a side note, but an important thing I think to mention, which Michael reminded me of, is that Yurik Bjornison gives Lyra a new name, which is Lyra Silverton. And I think it's, as Michael was mentioning, and if he wants to add anything, a really important character moment for Lyra. I think one might think, that lying and being not necessarily deceitful, but sort of lying and sort of tricking people might not necessarily be a good characteristic. But I really like how Philip Pullman sort of has Lyra have this quality and that it's to her advantage. And it's because she's able to do this, she's able to really defeat or overthrow very like large, powerful people or entities when one might not think that this like young girl can actually like do that. So I really liked that part of her character, that she's very willful and that she's like Lyra Silverton. I think also at the end of the book, when she finds out what Lord Asriel is also doing, she becomes disillusioned with both her parents and having a name given to her by, a Pansabjorna. I feel like she's able to sort of have this like new identity, which is very important for her character growth and development. So Lyra, Yurik, and Roger continue onward to Falbard, where Lord Asriel has continued his dust research in exile. When they arrive, Lord Asriel has a reaction that Lyra was not expecting, which is, "Why are you here? I did not ask for you. Do not come in. I did not want you." But then he sees Roger and he sort of acts normal as Lord Asriel can be. While they are there, them being Lyra and Roger, Lyra learns more about dust and what Lord Asriel is researching while he is in exile. He tells Lyra all that he knows about dust and that dust has spawned parallel universes, that it's connected to death and misery, and that the church believes it is the physical representation of original sin. And in this last bit, there is mention of Bible quotes, Bible verses, Bible verses, which is from dust we come, to dust we shall return. And he goes into a sort of longer philosophical discussion about dust, which we'll be talking about later in the episode. But basically, in the church's eye, dust is bad. And that is pretty much why they don't want kids to have dust on them. And that is the whole reason why they're trying to do the intercision process. So Lyra is sort of awoken in the middle of the night and realizes that Roger isn't there. And there's a moment of tremendous guilt that she has because she didn't read the alethiometer. And the alethiometer, she thinks after the fact, is trying to tell her something. And that thing is that Lord Asriel has basically kidnapped Roger. Poor Roger. I mean, like, he's a side character, but basically his whole life is real hard. So he gets kidnapped again, dragged through the snow by Lord Asriel, who is like not a nice dude. In the movie, he was played by Daniel Craig. So just like imagine like stone face, blue eyes, like you don't want to mess with him. So he's being dragged through the snow. And Lyra and Yurik are trying to follow Lord Asriel because, again, the main thing that Lyra was trying to do was save her best friend. And she is failing at that. Lord Asriel ascends a mountain with Roger, and Lyra and Yurik are trying to battle some bears and witches that are allied with Lord Asriel. At this moment, also Mrs. Coulter and the Tartars arrive in, I guess, military airships and start also attacking the bears. So it's this humongous battle, and Lyra is able to go even farther up the mountain where Lord Asriel is. And she witnesses Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter, her parents, coming back together in this very intense sort of embrace of like love and hatred. And she's witnessing that.
And it's important that when she witnesses them, it is like a very erotic in nature, and that's reflected in the way the demons are interacting with each other. There's a lot of sexual overtones in terms of how the demons are interacting with each other, while Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter embrace and kiss, and Lyra in that moment has this conflicting sense of hope that her parents are together and maybe they'll actually be her parents, but it's all mired in both their flaws. Mrs. Coulter trying to kill Roger and all these other children, essentially, and Lord Asriel actually killing Roger. So she knows that it's not right, and it's a key moment for her to recognize that she needs to set out on her own going forward.
And before she can get to Roger, Lord Asriel performs the intercision process on him because there's a tremendous amount of energy between that bond, and he uses that to tear a hole in the sky to go to a parallel universe. And he asks Mrs. Coulter if she will join him, and he says no. And Lord Asriel is like, well, I'm never going to talk to you again. I hate you. And like walks through. And Lyra then is absolutely devastated. Roger ends up dying from the intercision process, and Lyra and Pantalaimon decide to also pass through the gigantic tear in the sky that Lord Asriel has made. And that is the ending of the first book of his Dark Materials trilogy, The Golden Compass, Book 1.
Please remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you'd be so kind. If you have any requests for short stories or poetry, summaries, and analysis, please let me know in the comments. Feel free to ask me any questions related to your homework that you think I can help with. And stay lit with Simply Lit.